Hey fellow music fans, welcome back to Psychology of Rock. If you're new here, my name's Nina, and today's video is all about an artist that I deeply admired, not only as a singer, songwriter, guitarist, and performer, but also in general as a human being, and that is none other than Nirvana frontman Kurt Cobain. I'm a huge fan of his music and have been since the album Bleach came out. I feel like he has greatly influenced me as a guitar player, and that his songs have had a deep and meaningful impact on my life, and I know many of you feel exactly the same way. So today I wanted to offer a very detailed personality analysis of Kurt, which I think can help us to understand and appreciate who he was as a person on an even deeper level. So for this video, I will be using two different objective personality tests, the first of which is the Neo-PIR, which is built off of the 5-factor model of personality. The Neo assesses individuals in 5 different personality dimensions, as well as 6 subcategories or facets of these dimensions. I selected this test intentionally, not only because it's regarded as being highly scientific, but also because it is very comprehensive, and I think it's going to help us look a little deeper into the intricacies of Kurt's very unique personality. But then I will also talk about his likely MBTI, or Myers-Briggs Type Indicator personality type, as that is definitely the most requested personality inventory on this channel. I want to give a huge disclaimer before we start, however, that this analysis is purely speculative and based solely on my own opinion and the observations that I made watching interview and performance footage and studying his lyrics and other available information, as opposed to actually administering the tests on the individual himself. I would love to hear if you end up agreeing with this assessment, so don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments section below. Also, I want to quickly mention that it was claimed that Kurt was diagnosed with ADD and bipolar disorder during his lifetime, and if this were indeed true, it could have strongly influenced his behavior and personality. So that's something we want to keep in mind, as is the fact that we know he used substances, which can of course influence someone's mood, personality, and behavior as well. I do think, however, that we were able to see his genuine personality while he was still with us, so I think a thorough personality assessment is absolutely still possible, and I think he has a very interesting personality profile. So with that being said, let's dive straight into the analysis, and I want to go ahead and start with the Neo-PIR and talk about Kurt's likely scores for the big 5 personality traits. We can easily remember these traits through the acronym OCEAN, which are openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. The first trait we'll talk about is openness to experience. People who score high in this trait value intellectual matters, are creative and original, they are non-conforming, they value art, they are highly curious, they are independent and adventurous. People who score low favor conservative values, make judgments using conventional terms, are practical, and prefer routine. I would say that overall Kurt would score incredibly high in this trait. So let's go ahead and talk about each individual facet. The first is fantasy, which has to do with how active their imagination is. I think he would score very high here. I think it's safe to say that he liked to escape reality and create his own internal world, both in his mind and also in his art. The second is aesthetics. Now this has to do with sensitivity to art forms. So clearly he would score very high in this facet. Kurt appreciated and created many different types of art. He loved to draw, write poetry, to read. He played guitar and he sang, of course, and he was also very particular about any artwork that appeared in association with Nirvana. Some of this artwork he actually created himself, and he was also known for having a real vision for what he wanted to appear in his music videos. So I think he had a very strong eye for aesthetics. Number 3 is feelings. Now this has to do with attentiveness to inner emotions. I think he would score very high here as well. He seemed to definitely experience and acknowledge his emotions. He seemed to be very self-aware, and he also wrote about his emotions, which shows that he was able to acknowledge and maybe even process these emotions. Number 4 is actions. Now this has to do with preference for variety, novelty, and adventure. I think he would score moderate to high here. He definitely had a fast-paced and unconventional life. However, I don't think he would score quite as high as he did in other facets. He always said he was just as happy playing guitar in the basement as he was playing out to big stadiums. So I think that really shows that while he was appreciating the experiences that he was having, for the most part at least, he didn't necessarily seek out constant excitement, adventure, or action. Number 5 is ideas, which has to do with intellectual curiosity. I think he would score very high in this. He seemed to have a desire to understand the world around him and to dig deeper into topics that he found to be interesting. People that knew him described him as being philosophical, which definitely seems to be the case. He was clearly extremely intelligent and he liked to kind of entertain new ideas. And number 6 is values, which has to do with psychological liberalism. I think he would score very high here. He definitely did not seem to be glued to conventional thinking regarding social, political, or religious values. This is kind of obvious in the things that he alluded to in different interviews. It was clear that he was a lot more liberal, and I think he did not like to think like other people. I think he was kind of proud of the fact that he was more individualistic in the way he thought about things. The next trait we'll look at is conscientiousness. High scores tend to be productive, responsible, dependable, punctual, and hardworking, whereas people with a low score can be unable to delay gratification, can engage in daydreams, can be self-indulgent, lazy, late, disorganized, impulsive, and careless. So overall, I think he would score pretty low here, but let's go ahead and look at the 6 facets. The first is competence, which has to do with belief in yourself and your own abilities. I think it would score pretty low here. Now, I have heard some people call him egotistical. I do not agree with that. I don't think that was the case at all. I think it was more the case that he couldn't even take a compliment, not even about his art. He was very self-deprecating, even in his lyrics, where he directly called himself dumb and a failure. I don't think he had any idea how talented he actually was. I think he had some moments where he could see his greatness, but I think overall he was actually pretty shocked at the amount of attention that Nirvana was getting. Number 2 is order. This has to do with organization and tidiness. I think he would have scored extremely low in this facet. It definitely did not seem to be a priority for him. In fact, the whole grunge scene really revolved around the idea of disorder and not caring about your physical appearance or your physical environment, and I think Kurt really did embody that. Also, if Kurt really did have ADD, he would have struggled with executive function, which can directly lead to disorganization. Number 3 is dutifulness. Now this has to do with fulfilling obligations, especially moral obligations. I think he would score very low here as well. For the most part, it seemed like he did whatever he felt like doing. He did not have any desire to conform to social norms or to adhere to ethical principles that he did not agree with. I do, however, feel that he definitely fulfilled what he felt were his obligations as a musician and as a performer. I think he certainly felt the weight of these duties, but it's something that he took very, very seriously. Outside of music, however, I just don't think that this is an idea that he felt was very important. Number 4 is achievement striving, which has to do with setting and reaching goals. I think he would score moderate to low here, even though he was enormously successful. Outside of just being able to be a musician, I don't think he really aimed to have all these really far-reaching goals. I think it was more along the lines of he was so talented that he became famous, and it really wasn't the fact that these are things that he specifically set out to do. If anything, at the end, I think he almost lamented his success. I don't think he could have ever dreamed up or even conceived of the amount of attention that Nirvana would end up receiving. Number 5 is self-discipline, and this has to do with completing tasks. I think he would score pretty low in most areas, with the exception again being his art and music. He seemed to only really want to work hard when it was things that he enjoyed or found value in. I think otherwise he really lacked self-discipline, most likely because he did not find most conventional things to be that important. And number 6 is deliberation, which has to do with thinking situations out before you act, react, or speak. I think he would score very low here. I think sadly we can see this in his decision to use substances and in a lot of his life choices even very early on, such as running away in his youth and engaging in a lot of self-destructive behaviors. He also spoke very freely and off the cuff, even about topics that other people might steer away from. I see him as almost being overly honest in some situations, even when it didn't really portray him in the best light. I don't think he really cared what the price was for his self-expression. It definitely did not seem like a lot of careful planning went into anything he said or did, which on one hand made him very likable to fans because he was authentic and nothing he did really seemed calculated or contrived. But on the other hand, it really opened him up to a lot of the real tragedies that he experienced in his life because he failed to consider what the consequences of what some of these decisions might be. So let's move on to the next trait, which is extroversion. People with a high score tend to be talkative, assertive, socially poised, upbeat, outgoing, and energetic, whereas people with a low score are generally reserved, passive, quiet, withdrawn, and usually prefer to be alone or in small groups. I think Kurt would have scored low in this trait, not extremely low, but I would still put him in the low category. So let's go ahead and look at the 6 facets. The first is warmth, which has to do with being affectionate and friendly. I think he would score pretty low here. He definitely enjoyed being alone a lot of the time and he preferred to have a smaller number of close friends. But I do think he showed a lot of warmth to his inner circle and to his fans. He definitely came across as being very likable and he was never unfriendly in interviews. I think sometimes he even came across as being very playful. So I think maybe the better word to describe him would simply be to say reserved. The second facet is gregariousness, which has to do with enjoying the company of others. I think he would score low to average here. He was definitely picky about the people who he let into his world, but I do think he really did enjoy connecting with the people that he truly cared about. I think as an introvert, he simply had the need to be alone sometimes. Number 3 is assertiveness, which has to do with being dominant and speaking without hesitation. I think he would score low to average here as well. I think he definitely spoke his mind and he stood up for his art form and also for minority groups in a lot of cases, but this facet has a lot to do with being able to directly ask for what you want, which is something that I think he really did struggle with. I also don't see him as being dominant. He was bullied a lot when he was younger, so I think we would have to go with a lower score. The fourth facet is activity. Now this has to do with a sense of energy, leading a fast-paced life, and liking to keep busy. I would score him as average here. On one hand, he was in a band, and so his lifestyle was faster paced than most, but he also really tended to withdraw a lot. And I think that it's not the case that he necessarily needed to be busy all the time. It was simply that Nirvana was really successful and everything was moving really fast, and that just happened to be his reality. Number 5 is excitement seeking. Now this has to do with craving stimulation, sensation seeking, and liking noisy or bright environments. I think he would actually score average to high in this one. We can see this in his playing of loud and aggressive music, his use of substances, and even in his relationship with his wife, which seemed to be incredibly turbulent and filled with drama, yet be an environment that he could somehow function in for a number of years. And number 6 is positive emotions, and this has to do with exactly what it sounds like, the tendency to experience positive emotions such as joy, love, happiness, and excitement. I would score him as low to average here, maybe a little bit closer to the lower side. We know he experienced a lot of sadness in his childhood. I don't think he was necessarily unhappy as an adult. We do see a lot of footage where he appears to be happy and playful, but I definitely wouldn't call him a joyful person. I think if we look at his lyrics, it points to him experiencing a lot of negative emotions, being very sensitive, and having a lot of inner turmoil. So let's move on to the next trait, which is agreeableness. High scorers tend to be considerate, sympathetic, warm, likable, trusting, compassionate, and good-natured, whereas low scorers tend to be skeptical, critical, uncooperative, irritable, suspicious of others, express hostility directly, and can be condescending. I think overall Kurt would have a very average score here, but let's go through the facets because I think they are really up and down and just kind of balance out to have that average score. The first is trust, and this has to do with the belief that others others are honest and well-intentioned. I think he would score pretty low in this facet, which is not that uncommon for children who have been through divorce, especially in cases like Kurt's, where he didn't necessarily feel secure or stable in either household. After this happened, I think kind of in general, he had this air of skepticism of people and situations, even when things were going his way. It really seemed that he almost had this core belief that everything good will eventually go bad, and he seemed to always simply be waiting for that to happen. Number 2 is straightforwardness. Now this has to do with being frank, sincere, and ingenuous. I think his score would be pretty average here. He seemed to be very honest, and even though he didn't seem to love confrontation, I think he also didn't feel the need to hold back his opinion or sugarcoat things even when his views were unpopular. So I think in that regard, he was fairly straightforward. Number 3 is altruism, which has to do with concern for the welfare of others and the willingness to help others in need. I think his score would be average here as well. I think a lot of his energy was actually focused on self-protection, so I don't think he always had a lot of energy to spend in this way, but he was also incredibly empathetic, and I think he really did care greatly for the welfare of other people, especially people he was close to and people he sympathized with. I think it was also very evident that he cared greatly about the welfare of his fans. He didn't even want them to pay high ticket prices. This is something that Nirvana was very adamant about. I also remember at least on one occasion that he stopped a show because of how a female was being treated. So I think these are things that were definitely important to him. It was important to him to be a good and kind person, and he was a good and kind person. Number 4 is compliance. This has to do with characteristic reactions to interpersonal conflict and how willing someone is to forgive and forget and inhibit aggression. I think he would score very low here. He seemed to have anger issues. There was a lot of conflict in many of his relationships. He seemed to take a lot of things personally, and I don't really think he felt that being compliant was an admirable trait. Number 5 is modesty, and this has to do with being humble as opposed to lacking in self-esteem or self-confidence. I think he would actually score very high here, even though I don't really feel that he ever gave himself the credit he was really due. He never came across as being arrogant. He never bragged about his success or the success of the band. And even until his very last days, he always seemed to be very down to earth. And number 6 is tender-mindedness, which has to do with attitudes of sympathy and concern for others. I think he would score average here. He was kind of a loner, but as we discussed earlier, he did care deeply for a lot of people. He definitely stood up for gay rights and women's rights and the rights of other minorities. I think he cared specifically about these populations, but I think overall he just really believed in equality. He also went on record saying that he was disgusted by the apathy of his generation on these issues and that he didn't want anyone who expressed hate of any kind to any group to go to his shows or to buy his records. And now we'll move on to the final personality trait, which is neuroticism. People who score high tend to be anxious, temperamental, self-conscious, emotional, thin-skinned, and prone to negative emotions, whereas people that score low tend to be relaxed, calm, even-tempered, and secure with self. Overall, I would give him a score of very high, and we'll go through all of the 6 facets, but I do feel that he would have scored high to very high in each and every one of them. The first is anxiety, which has to do with being apprehensive, fearful, and prone to worry. I think he struggled greatly with fear and anxiety in his childhood, starting with his parents' divorce, and then it seemed to just kind of continue into his adulthood. It was very well documented that he suffered from anxiety greatly all the way up until his death. Number 2 is angry hostility. Now this has to do with the tendency to experience anger and related states like bitterness and frustration. I think he was very open and honest about having these feelings, and these are certainly themes that we can see over and over again in his lyrics. I feel that this could have stemmed from his childhood, where he claimed he had a lot of experiences that caused him to feel anger and hostility, such as his parents' divorce or being bullied in school. Any of these experiences could have contributed to feeling these intense negative emotions. Number 3 is depression, which has to do with being prone to feelings of hopelessness, guilt, loneliness, and sadness. I think this was incredibly evident in his life, and he stated directly on many occasions that he did feel alone and that he struggled with feelings of shame and guilt. And I think this could have been one of the big reasons why he tried to self-medicate and why he engaged in so many self-destructive behaviors. Also, if Kurt really was bipolar, he would have certainly had periods of clinical depression as part of this disorder. So I think he definitely would have scored very high in this facet as well. Number 4 is self-consciousness. Now, this is connected to feeling embarrassment or self-shame and a sense of inferiority to others. Kurt mentioned on many occasions that he never really felt like he fit in anywhere, and his mother went on record saying that he was very sensitive to criticism and he struggled a lot with self-doubt in his childhood. I think that even though the world really loved him, he really did struggle with self-love. Number 5 is impulsiveness, which has to do with the inability to control urges, desires, or cravings. I don't think anyone would argue that he would have scored incredibly high in this facet. Again, we see this in his use of substances and in his reckless behavior and impulsive decisions. I think he had a lifelong pattern of being impulsive, which could have directly related to attention deficit disorder if he indeed had it. And number 6 is vulnerability, which has to do with the inability to cope with stress and the perception of being incapable of handling difficult situations. I think unfortunately we really see this as a theme in Kurt's life, where he simply had no idea how to handle everything that his life had become with the success of Nirvana. He seemed at the end to almost always be on the verge of a nervous breakdown. His life had become overwhelming and stressful, and he was really at a loss at how to navigate it all, which made him very vulnerable. I think we really see a lifetime pattern of having difficulty coping with stressful situations, starting way back in his childhood. He may have even run away physically because he was trying to run away from his own emotions. He was trying to escape how he was feeling. I think what really added to this is that he never really felt like he had a reliable support system, even when he was completely surrounded with people that truly loved him. I don't think he ever really trusted that. So that is my assessment using the Neo-PIR, but as promised, I also want to offer what I believe to be Kurt's likely MBTI personality profile, which I think really does line up very nicely with everything we already talked about today. I strongly believe that Kurt was an INFP, meaning he was introverted, intuitive, feeling, and perceiving. So let's go ahead and look at some of the characteristics that are associated with this personality type. INFPs are sensitive, private, creative, quiet, loyal, curious, and reserved. They prefer interacting with a select group of close friends and can be drained in social situations. INFPs typically rely on their intuition to make decisions and are more focused on the big picture rather than small details. They are known for being meticulous about personal interests and projects they are working on, but tend to ignore any mundane or boring aspects. They can be overly idealistic, tend to take things personally, and can be difficult to get to know. They are often skilled with language, but can prefer to express their feelings and thoughts through writing rather than speaking. People with this personality type spend a lot of time exploring their own purpose in life and seek to live according to their personal values. So those are my thoughts on Kurt Cobain. I truly feel that he was one in a million. I have so much respect for his art and so much compassion for him as a person. Not only did he struggle with mental illness and physical illness and addiction, but he also had immense pressure on him from the sudden rise to fame that he experienced, which is something that who knows how we would handle if we were in that situation. Despite all this, he managed to be a charming, kind, brilliant, and incredibly decent human being who continues to inspire people around the globe even though he is no longer with us. I would love to hear whether or not you agree with today's assessment, so don't forget to leave a comment down below. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you have not done so already. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today, and I will see you next week.